Attention, this is one spooked professor speaking. Would all budding horror movie antagonists put on your masks, grab your favorite killing implement, pat your inner sadist on the head, and tell stupid teens to get lost? Today we're in it for the blood and gore. If the title of the episode didn't give it away, we're going to be looking at slasher films and their bastard offspring, the new kid on the block, the torture porn flick. Both of these subgenres of horror have their defining films and followings, but they suffer from many of the same critiques, those being their exploitative nature, apparent sadism, use of schlock horror and gore over subtler methods, tendency towards series decay through sequelitis, and claims of emptiness. That being said, a handful of slashers have become pop culture icons, and their films are justifiably influential. One could say classics even. While newer, the torture porn genre too has left its mark on horror. Because of this episode's focus, we're going to be looking at film a lot. That isn't to say that slashers and torturers don't appear in literature, comics, video games, even theater, but these two subgenres came to be as we know them through their cinematic form, and thus the majority of our focus today must be on that medium. A lot of the appeal of the slasher movie and the torture film comes from these visual elements, which may be a part of the reason why these two genres are so dominant in film and not so much in radio. The radio genre, after all, is great at mysteries because of the lack of visual elements. If a lot of your particular storytelling format thrives on visuals, lack of that visual feature, bit of an issue. Let's start with slasher films. Slashers were inspired by the Giallo films, which in turn derived from Il Giallo Mondadori. Forgive my incredibly poor Italian pronunciation, you're gonna have to suffer through a lot of it if you stick around. These books get their name from their bright yellow color, and are basically the Italian pulps. You might be familiar with Pulp Fiction already and know I'm not referencing the movie, though you might watch that for a good time now and then. I'm talking about the cheap-to-print literature designed to thrill and entertain. Pulps got their name from the cheap, pulpy material used to make their pages. You can see that we're going to deal with a lot of literal naming. Slashers, torture porn, the pulps, Il Giallo Mondadori, yellow. Wow, startling with the literal. Kinda reminds me of the time when I learned that all the scientific terms for animals are basically just describing features like a 5-year-old. Horn nose! Rhinoceros! Ugh. Suddenly I realized that scientists were pulling the wool over my eyes with the Latin, and sometimes the Greek. Back to Il Giallo Mondadori, these books often contain translated mystery and thrill works by authors like Agatha Christie. This eventually led to the Giallo film genre that in turn had roots in the West German creamy films, which were also mostly inspired by the works of author Edgar Wallace. You see how there's a web of influence that connects these things? This is why I have a problem with people who claim that nothing is original. Art doesn't exist in a vacuum or pop out of nowhere. It develops from other artists and the world around us. There is no more useless term than derivative, because all art is derivative. Art evolves. Artists are influenced by what is around them. There is a reason why we study literary trends, film trends, and the like. There are few words I hold in greater disdain than that of the dismissive cry of derivative. Giallo's trademarks and key influences in shaping what would become the slasher are its violent murders that can be over the top to the point of being ridiculous. The murder victims are often beautiful, vulnerable women. Tack on that they're often killed while not wearing much, and you can begin to understand the voyeuristic nature of what's going on here. The murders are often committed by masked killers whose identities are revealed towards the end of the film. Giallo also channels psychological horror by focusing on the fear and paranoia of the main characters they're hunted, or on the reason behind the killer's madness and violence. These focuses would later prove the framework for the final girl slasher relationship. Camera work often played a part in hiding the identity of the killer and often focused on violence, vivid colors, surrealistic art, clues, and psychologically important items. Sometimes the film would even switch to the point of view of the killer, obviously bringing the audience along for the ride, changing the power dynamic of the audience's experience. Now, the killers in the Giallo films could be supernatural in nature or have magical powers and the like, but most of the time they were just psychologically disturbed human beings. Hollywood's obsession with murder really gets its start after the American film Psycho, though there are other influential films as well that pulled horror away from the monster movies of the 1950s and into a new direction that could come through your door without really stomping on the whole house. Black Christmas and Texas Chainsaw Massacre are the true beginning of the slasher genre in the Americas, one of those being Canadian. In these, we see a focus on younger victims in isolated locations who find themselves at the mercy of a psychopathic killer. There is less emphasis in these two films on the cyclical nature of the killer's psychosis, themes of revenge, and other tropes that will become important to slashers later on. You can also still clearly see a lot of the connections to the Giallo Mondadori films, and perhaps even to the older Creamy films, in how these were constructed. Also, in this case, both killers win. The final girl may live in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but her victory is Pyrrhic at best, and Leatherface remains clearly undefeated. It's hard to call these deviations from the mold because the final girl's victory as part of the pattern hasn't been established yet. Consider these steps in the evolving genre that will eventually become what we recognize. They are still, obviously, slasher films. The true codification of the slasher genre comes from John Carpenter, who gave us Halloween. The film was originally called The Babysitter Murders, and thank goodness they changed that title to cash in on the holidays. Babysitter Murders does not have the same ring to it at all. The name change also may have been inspired by Black Christmas, though there is some dispute over that. It also defined an essential aspect of the killer: when he kills. Just as important is the final girl trope. Laurie Strode is the poster girl for the final girl archetype, though she isn't the first final girl that we've found in pop culture. The trope is a tad older, and if you look back at folklore, may be older than feudalism. What is the final girl, though? The term generally refers to the last survivor in a slasher movie, who just so happens to almost always be female. The older the work, the more likely the girl is to be a virgin if they're not already married. They've remained clothed most of the time in the movie and avoided sex throughout the film, something that has usually claimed at least one poor girl or guy throughout the experience. The final girl has avoided a lot of vices, remaining something of a moral paragon compared to the rest of the cast, especially since many horror stories follow the old traditions of the morality tales that they came from. So you can see those archetypical morality tale conventions at work even in the slasher genre. This final girl also tends to be smarter and more resourceful than the others. She doesn't always win, but she often does, though sometimes that run of victories doesn't survive the sequels or the after-credits scene. Taking a wider look at the proto-slashers before Halloween and the refined versions to come afterward, we see that many of them have iconic looks that make them recognizable, marketable, memorable. You've got Freddy Krueger with his scars and that awful striped sweater. You've got Jason Voorhees' hockey mask, and Leatherface, well, he gets his name from that little person mask he wears. They also often have distinctive, characterful, sometimes even emblematic weapons and methodologies that we associate with them. Shocker, like real-life serial killers, we remember them based on how they kill and what they kill with. Freddy Krueger hunts people in their dreams, is a pedophile, and he comes after people with that little clawed glove. Leatherface has got that chainsaw that's in the name of the movie, and he's a cannibal. Jason Voorhees is very well known for that machete, though clearly he is willing to use just about anything at hand. And then, oh, Michael Myers, you've got a thing for knives. The more we go into different slashers, the more we're going to see that they tend to be associated with what they do and how they do it. Really, like everyone else, so in a way, aren't we all alike? Don't we want recognition? Don't we want to be unique? What the hell am I talking about? These slashers also tend to follow archetypical patterns. You've got the big brute slasher, who tends to be very difficult to kill, often wears a mask, is dehumanized in multiple ways, and may be invulnerable because of some supernatural storytelling device. Then you've got the charmers, who smile, who fake it, who can sneak their way into your heart and make you drop your guard. These are very similar to real-life serial killers who use charm or helplessness or good looks to lure you in. Then you've got the super intelligent ones, perhaps the ones that make traps or try and kill you with logic and all sorts of other things. Then, of course, you've got those who are freaks in some way, whether it's a disease or some sort of condition or scar, something that has marked them as different from humans, and they often react in rage to those who have rejected them. You've also got the revenge-driven slasher, who may be just a normal person who has been pushed too far by the circumstances they've found themselves in. This can include rape victims who go hunting down their rapists one by one, someone who is trying to kill you because you were indirectly involved in hurting someone they love or directly involved in it, or someone who merely thinks they've been wronged. There's a lot of different levels to this one, and many of these avenging slashers are the heroes of their respective work. Charles Bronson certainly seems like a slasher, and goodness gracious, the Punisher from comics, he has several slasher hallmarks, including his body count and seeming inability to be killed. Then there are the supernatural slashers who seem to be more elemental instruments of evil or death, or urban legends come to life, like the Candyman. And keep in mind, these archetypes can mix and match and meld with each other. One size doesn't fit all. Oftentimes, these killers will be used for allegories or in reference, symbolically at the very least, or through subtext, to ongoing events or fears. Quite obviously, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is related to the meat industry, and you'll often see other cultural fears and bugaboos represented in the trends that make it into these movies. The heyday of the slasher genre also coincides with what we often call the golden age of serial killers, that big boom in serial killers from the 1950s to the early 2000s. And we see a shift towards the torture porn flick later that parallels the war on terror and a greater fear of the domestic terrorists, the foreign terrorists, and we'll get to all that later. But these parallels are important in terms of the cultural conversation going on within these slasher movies. They're not just there. Very little that I talk about in the series is just there for no reason. Other societal fixations of dread focus on women's sexuality, gender identity, ongoing wars, consumerism, socialism, the destruction of the environment, and even xenophobia. Virtually all of these societal and personal fears are the slasher's hunting ground. Freudian symbolism and Jungian archetypes, they're going to be there too. Well, at least some of the time. Now, you'll notice that a lot of slasher films are defined by the past, or in this case, the present events of the film or TV series, in the case of the TV show Slasher, are defined by what either happened to the killer or happened to the victims, or both, in the past. Jason Voorhees is probably the best example of this. Why is Jason what he is now? Or in the case of the first one, why did his mother become a vengeful killer going after teens? It's because of what happened to Jason. He drowned. Because the camp counselors were too busy having sex to notice that kids were bullying this poor kid named Jason, and whoopsie daisies, he drowned in Camp Crystal Lake's lake. So I suppose we just call it Crystal Lake. That is its name, after all. Even Fred Krueger, who is a horrible, nefarious man and in no way really someone that we should sympathize with as a victim. The guy was sexually abusing and murdering children. After he escaped scot-free on a technicality, the parents of the children he killed and whose children were under threat cornered him in a warehouse and burned down the warehouse around him, killing him. Well, the whole reason he is that specter slasher hunting those children of those parents and all the children that come after is because of what they did to him. That's why he's all scarred. That's why he's out for revenge. So revenge, in this case, created more revenge and more evil. In the original Halloween, Michael Myers is recreating the cycle of his sister's murder in the case that he is now going after Laurie Strode, his remaining sister. And we still see the cyclical nature of the holiday coming around every year as a new potential reign of terror for Michael Myers, depending on which train of movies we're following as canon. Leatherface is defined by his abusive family and the rejections he faced from other people, turning him into the insular killer that we recognize as the lovely little dude wearing the apron and a face. There are cycles of violence that we're fixated on, and this is probably in some way related to the fact that post-World War II, and even a little bit before it, we're much more concerned with the psychological origins of evil and with the systematized nature of evil. How do people become evil? Are they born that way? What cycles of violence get perpetuated? Things like that. And this is reflected in how the movies construct the stories of these killers. Now, you'll notice I keep saying slasher instead of serial killer, and that's because not all of these slasher characters would qualify as serial killers. There are two different kinds of mass murderers we're primarily working with here, and those are serial killers and spree killers. Sometimes the line between those two doesn't exist. The serial killer will be a serial killer until he's discovered, and then he'll go on a murder spree. But serial killers kill on multiple separate occasions with cooldown times in between. I believe the minimum number for a serial killer to kill to become a serial killer is 3, which might mean Ed Gein no longer qualifies. Sadness. A spree killer is kind of indicative with the naming. He's doing all of this killing in one spree and then usually is either arrested or goes out in a blaze of violence. Many slashers, particularly those who headline franchises, go on killing sprees interrupted by cooldown periods, so they have elements of both. Now, some, like Jason's mom, just went on one killing spree, so she's just a spree killer. Fred Krueger was just a serial killer until he became the nightmarish boogeyman-like Freddy Krueger dream demon that we know and love. The supernatural Pinhead certainly operates in sprees of when he is released. Most real-life killers don't really survive their first spree killing. It's pretty much one and done for them. When you're a supernatural killer, you fall into that area where you get sprees, but you have a break in between them. That break's length being determined by how much money you make and when the next sequel or reboot is coming along. Like many horror franchises, slasher series tend to be villain-driven franchises. If there is a lead protagonist in one movie, that protagonist may not necessarily survive the next one, but the killer will keep coming back again and again and again. Halloween is not Laurie Strode's movie, it is Michael Myers' movie, as are all of the others except that one Season of the Witch one that makes no sense and that I couldn't fathom even as a child. That was terrible. Jason Voorhees is the headlining character of the Friday the 13th series, and so on and so forth. We only follow the hero characters, or the victims, as the case may be, insofar as they relate with the monsters. Thus, these slashers end up picking up anti-heroic qualities. They are, in a way, the protagonist of their own stories as much as they are the antagonists of the many narratives that make up each film. They also invariably play the largest role in merchandise and in fan memory. Sequelitis on the more popular slasher killers also means they have to venture outside of their original wheelhouse. Fred Krueger has certainly killed people in more creative ways than just his hand claw and a bed blender. And there are actually movies where Jason Voorhees, at least one that I can remember, does not actually use his signature machete at all. Like the Giallo films, the more the audiences got used to and were desensitized to, the more creative and silly the killing sometimes got. This often leads to franchise fatigue, as it just strains any credibility that the story had, and audiences just go, well, this is so stupid, or just lose sight of what the story was originally about. The same thing can also occur to the very writers and people making the slasher work. Sequelitis in general can often become a problem for any long-running series. But we could spend a whole episode talking about just sequelitis and the whole notion of making sequels to horror stories, which by nature are some of the most difficult kinds of stories to attach additions to. For now, I want to move to the second stage of this episode. A direct descendant of the slasher film is the dubiously dubbed torture porn flick. No, this is not something that you look up on the deep web or on sites that you purge from your computer history as soon as you visited them. This is actually an appellation given to a form of splatter film, and sometimes to all splatter films. Some critics and websites use the terms splatter film and torture porn interchangeably. I'm going to treat torture porn as a derivative and descendant of earlier splatter films because I believe they've become something recognizable on their own that has been influenced both by earlier splatter films, exploitation films, and the slasher genre itself. Let's start with what a splatter film is, though. Splatter films use graphic and sometimes very, very graphic portrayals of violence as their central form of horror. It's very in your face and not subtle at all, I assure you. This is partly why so many splatter films become bad schlock horror and lack nuance, though not all, I'll be fair. There are some that are good. As a child, I really enjoyed them, and maybe I shouldn't use the phrase as a child. I enjoyed splatter horror. Probably shouldn't have seen that as a child at all, but hey, that explains why I'm here making this podcast, doesn't it? And partly why I've slept with the lights on for so long. The genre focuses on the visceral and the visual, and arguably the best splatter films can turn gore into an art form and sometimes even throw in a little social commentary while they're at it. The worst, which is by far the dominant portion of the genre, but still sometimes a lot of fun, completely eschew any mystery and other fears to just revel in wanton violence and spectacle. The name of the genre comes from George Romero, who coined the term splatter cinema to describe his anti-consumerist zombie film Dawn of the Dead. Splatter cinema owes its creative roots to realistic and graphic displays of carnage depicted at the French theater of the Great Puppet, the Grand Guignol. Again, I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. Its cinematic forms, like the slasher films mentioned before, draw upon the legacy of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. It really came into its own as a subgenre in the 1960s upon the release of the film Blood Feast. Bet that title fooled so many moviegoers back in the day into thinking it was going to be a romance movie with plenty of flowers. And naturally, this genre saw considerable conflict in the form of censorship and social blowback. You begin to get the idea of what splatter films are all about, though. It's in the 2000s that the torture porn genre emerged, merging elements of splatter films and slasher films together into something new. Saw and Hostel are by far the most famous and popular codifications of the result of this union. The Audition and The Human Centipede are also memorable films that you could pick up just about anywhere, and there are also certainly many grindhouse horror movies and thrillers that tiptoe over the line into what some would definitely consider torture porn. Torture in the torture porn genre tends to have certain basic elements, as defined by Aaron Michael Kerner. 1. The torture is not happening for the purpose of interrogation. 2. The torture is the source of horror. 3. Transformation of torturers and victims often leads to role reversal. 4. Reversal of the victim turned torturer often is used to justify the exhibition of violence. 5. Torture porn usually involves realistic elements that ground it in reality, rather than supernatural ones. Though even these are not necessarily guaranteed. Steve Jones laments that it is indeed difficult to define the torture porn genre, and there has been less critical scholarship on it to boot. Still, it is definitely a form of spectacle horror. There are also a few elements that separate it from the whole slasher genre tropes that we've covered. There is often no final girl. Just as often, men are the protagonists. The struggle is also focused on not just the physical, but emotional torture a person experiences, combining together. The stakes are also often elevated by twist endings, and these are often bigger twists than just who was the killer or is the killer really dead. Like slashers, torture porn can also intermingle with psychological horror. Sadism, morbid curiosity, and sympathy for the victim can combine at the same time, and it's less about the thrill of the chase. Entrapment is far more important. Freudian reasons for the killing or motivations of the killer demonstrate the bestial or inhuman nature of people and societies, not just of one poor, deranged person. This also often involves breaking of societal boundaries. It often reflects awareness of personal vulnerability, particularly in the wake of 9/11 in American and European films. Torture porn is also more prone to be used in urban environments than slasher fics, isolation being created in different ways, like a locked room. The Human Centipede and the like often include body horror, some sort of mutilation, as a part of the torture. So far, I've talked primarily about film, and that's because these genres are primarily codified in the public mind in the form of film. The narrative conventions of the torture porn and slasher genre exist in other mediums as well. Some of them came after the two subgenres hit the film. Some are actually older. I've already mentioned two of them, the pulps and stage plays that focus on the ghoulish spectacle. One could argue that this form of spectacle-based schadenfreude is best epitomized by the Roman gladiatorial games and beast hunts. While Hollywood films and TV shows like The Star or Spartacus exaggerate the number of gladiators actually killed in these events, they still involve death, mutilation, and pain for the enjoyment of others. Most of the casualties were beasts, untrained slaves, and criminals set for execution, but not all gladiators made it out of these situations either. Most gladiators were really more akin to professional wrestlers, though. Human desire for suffering as entertainment doesn't end with other people. Animal fighting like dogfights, cockfights, and other animal battles also appear throughout history and in some cases wind up on YouTube. Not all forms of schadenfreude are physical, though. People fixate on the social dismemberment of whatever the scandal of the week happens to be, and that's not even getting into the most exploitative of reality shows and gossip channels and the like. We are still enjoying the pain and suffering of another, especially if it ruins their lives. Schadenfreude can best be defined as the experience of pleasure, joy, satisfaction, what have you, that comes from learning of or even witnessing yourself the failure, suffering, and humiliation of another human being. People who indulge in schadenfreude do so in many different ways, often whatever is culturally acceptable in their society, but sometimes even beyond that. Children are a bit more obvious about it, but let's face it, adults are big on it too. The reasons for schadenfreude tend to fall into three separate categories, but there is often a great deal more than this, and a commingling between these categories. There is aggression-based schadenfreude, which primarily involves group identity. This joy comes from observing the suffering of others, and is felt by the observer feeling that the other's failure represents an improvement or validation of their own group status or in-group status in relation to external groups. This is basically part of a group versus group conflicts. If you hate women or you hate men, the suffering of a member of that group maybe something you enjoy, or if you feel it improves the situation of your own group. Well, this is the political adversary, so bad things happening to them makes me feel good, or you hate this type of person, so you enjoy things when it happens to them. That is all aggression-based schadenfreude. Then you have rivalry-based schadenfreude. This is more individualistic and is focused on interpersonal competition. It arises from our desire to stand out and outperform other people. Whenever another individual's misfortune makes us feel good because we now feel better than them, this is a case of rivalry-based schadenfreude, particularly if we really don't like that person. The last is justice-based schadenfreude. It comes from when we see things that we deem as immoral or bad punished. This is when we can dehumanize someone because, well, they've just done something wrong, so they obviously deserve it. We don't need to feel bad about it. We can take pleasure in it. If you take a look at the forms of interhuman cruelty that we have been very good at dumping on one another throughout history, you'll find it can often be related to one of these forms of schadenfreude. And schadenfreude is deeply ingrained in both the slasher and torture porn genre, especially when it comes to security. Ever heard of Denishan Alphonse Francois before? Maybe it's just because I've garbled the name so badly with my poor French pronunciations, or maybe you'd know this person by another name. The Marquis de Sade. Long before the film torture porn genre and the story conventions within it, mixed with sex and virtually everything else under the sun, came to be in the works of the man whose very name has led to the word sadism. Remember how I mentioned earlier that these thoughts don't just come out of nowhere and they all link together in a long-term development? Meet one of the forebearers! I can go on and on about great historical examples of schadenfreude and other forms it has taken, but I just wanted to point out some of the highlights before focusing on slashers and their descendants. I also want to talk, too, about other forms that the slasher and torture porn genre have taken besides film. Video games like Friday the 13th and Dead by Daylight, comics, come on, The Punisher, hardcore horror literature, including creepypastas, they're all out there. Slasher satires or references appear almost everywhere. There are even Japanese anime that have references to Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger, and virtually every long-running cartoon comedy has mocked them at one point or another. There's even a role-playing game where you can play as or fight against a slasher. The Chronicles of Darkness, once known as the New World of Darkness, have Hunter the Vigil. One of the source books for the game is the delightful, and aptly named, Slasher. There are slashers here that are divided into 10 types that actually describe the different forms of slasher very well. These 10 types are further divided into two subtypes of 5, The first 5 being the normal mundane slashers, the other 5 being the more supernatural ones. Both of these subgenres we've talked about have invariably found themselves the subjects of satire, and really, who can deny that they lend themselves to that kind of mockery very well? Part of the reason for this is because there's an established pattern. When you have codified tropes that everyone comes to expect, then you don't have as many surprises. Tropes can be overused, becoming cliches, and there is little else more fun than to make fun of a cliche. Never mind the fact that both of these set themselves up for it with the problem that assails both film genres. In slashers, the kills are over-stylized and over the top, getting more over the top so as not to go stale. The same can occur with the torture porn genre, with the torture scenes, especially in a long-running series, becoming absolutely ridiculous. I mean, look at the later Death Traps 2 and Saw. Torture porn, being newer and shorter-lived, doesn't have quite as many series under its belt, but it still gets the same treatment. And both are going to find themselves hitting parody levels rather quickly if the creators are not careful. Eventually, the suspension of disbelief gets violated. The slasher and torture porn genres, however, have survived so well and hit the nerves they have because of their monster. Us. When you stop and think about it, where else are we going to get monsters? There was once a time where we could say, hey, beyond the edges of this map, there may very well be dragons. There are lands you have never visited with things that have not been really even described to you. And the more we began to search out those little crevices and nooks of the world, the less places we had to hide our monsters. Alexander the Great could write about monsters he met, or things that tried to attack his people on their campaigns through Persia. But once we could go and see what was in the region, there were not really any monsters to be found. Some things that were once considered monsters are now considered mundane, and we're running out of places to hide the mysterious. This is why we tend to look in places like the ocean or into space for other creatures and monsters, because it's the only places where we can believably hide them, besides the most common monster that we're ever going to come across, us. The evils humans have perpetrated against each other are very well documented. And come on, do you ever really know any of the people that you're around? How many of you have looked someone in the eye and gone, I know exactly what's back there, you are no threat to me? And how many of those people have been fucking wrong? It's one of the few places where we have the mystery of horror still left to us. And from that mystery and some of the things that we've seen people capable of doing, we still have access to dragons. Look at your neighbor. Here there may be a dragon. The torture porn genre in particular thrives on the societal version of this fear after 9/11. The fact that the heyday of the torture porn genre also coincides with a time period where the United States was utilizing torture as a information gathering method, despite the fact that it is not as effective as other methods of getting information, tells us something about both the fear that was around at the time, the insecurity, and also the security one can feel by inflicting pain on those it deems dangerous. Why have some people tortured? Because it made them feel safe, it made them feel powerful. And in many cases, the torturers or the torturees become torturers experience that power reversal. That awareness of systemic issues and monsters among us feeds into the torture porn genre the same way that wars like Vietnam and the fear of serial killers played into the long-running slasher genre in the United States. Both the slasher and torture porn genres have waned of late, giving way to more familial and personal horror, like the kind you'd see in Hereditary, Get Out, Bird Box, A Quiet Place, and This Is Us. Paranormal horror like Insidious, Paranormal Activity, and the Conjuring series are also up and about as well. But slashers and torturers still have strong influence on the horror genre as a whole, and with the success of the Halloween remake and the possibility of both new entries into the series and the return of old names, their future isn't particularly bleak. There are some criticisms about the respective genres' value to art, and I invariably find such critical values dissonance to be relativistic and often simplistic. Do I think that these grindfest genres filled with torturers and slashers are artistically viable and relevant? Yes, as much as any other creative work can be. In short, the genre is only as limited in what it can do by those who create the works within it. But that's an argument all on its own, and that's not what this episode's really about. I appreciate that all of you listen to me ramble, and remember, if you're in an isolated location and you hear some noise outside, maybe think twice about going to investigate on your own. Doodles all.